We are back with Dr. Tyler Martin from a previous episode that we did on Nebraska Made, physician, scientist, and biotech entrepreneur. We're going to talk a little bit today about the COVID vaccine, some of the hesitancies that people are having around it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, JT. I'm pleased to be here.
Cool. The first rounds of vaccines are, well, I guess this isn't even the first round. This is like the kind of the final rounds of vaccines are out. Has everyone been offered a vaccine now that could get one?
In the United States, people who are old enough, that is 16 or older, everyone is eligible for vaccine now. And the rate of new vaccines is going down. So we think that means everyone who wants vaccine has basically had it or is close to having it. Mm-hmm. We're almost to the point where everybody in the U.S. who's over the age of 16 and wants a vaccine has probably had it.
Okay. So
But that's not the case in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, 0.3% of people have been immunized.
Wow.
Which is why you hear about the situation in India, for example, where COVID is out of control right now, because we haven't been able to immunize the rest of the world.
So let's first talk about the efficiency of these vaccines. I know it's not one vaccine. I'm hearing about 95% success rates with the vaccines. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, so there's different rates amongst the different vaccines. The RNA vaccines, which are the ones that most people in the U.S. have gotten, so that's the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine, they're both about 95%, which is important to remember and why we still have the same guidelines that we do now, that 95% is not 100%. The next vaccines would be the J&J and AstraZeneca vaccines. J&J is approved in the U.S. AstraZeneca is not yet approved in the U.S. They're more on the order of, say, low 90%. And then the Novavax vaccine, which is not yet approved in the U.S., looks like it may be the best of all. It may get approved, say, in the July timeframe or so. So we'll end up with having 5 vaccines that'll be available in the United States.
So let's talk about the questions that people are asking you, the most frequently asked questions. It's probably around safety and probably ethics of,
those are
should
probably
am I obligated to get this vaccine?
Yeah. Well, so let's break it out into safety first. The ethics, there's really kind of 2 different questions on the ethics side. But so for safety, there are 2 aspects of safety that we want to collect information about. The first one is short-term safety, and the second is long-term safety. So for short-term safety, we actually have a ton of information about these vaccines. Both for Pfizer and J&J, they'd immunized about, Pfizer and Moderna, they'd immunized about 20,000 people at the time they were approved. Most vaccines at the time they were approved have immunized more like 5,000 to 10,000 people. So we actually had more short-term safety data on these 2 vaccines than we normally have with any other vaccine that's ever approved. So we knew more about the short-term safety. So there's never really been an issue about short-term safety. The thing we don't know is long-term safety, because of course these vaccines haven't been around for a long time, and because it usually takes more like 10 years to develop a vaccine. By the time you're done, you've had people who were immunized 10 years ago, and you can have all this long-term safety. Now, you only have it on a few thousand people, but you've got a lot of data. You've got a lot of people with long-term data. In this case, these vaccines have only been around for a year. So there is nobody that's got a lot of long-term data. So that's the data that we'll have to wait to see it come out. Now, we have really good safety monitoring systems. So good, for instance, that after 8 million people were immunized with the J&J vaccine, we discovered a safety issue that occurred at a frequency of 1 in a million. So we haven't ruled out every single possible safety event that's happened, because you don't really get that until you've exposed more and more people. So for instance, you won't find a 1 in a billion event until you've immunized several billion people. But the point is, we're so good that we can find, or the safety systems are so good that we can find rates that occur at 1 in a million once you've got 8 million people exposed to the vaccine. So we can now say that safety events that happen within, say, 6 months after dosing don't occur at a frequency more than 1 in a million, other than this unusual blood clotting thing that is associated with probably both the AstraZeneca and the J&J vaccines.
Has there ever been a case of a vaccine that did have a long-term side effect that was maybe a bigger PR event that people might have heard of?
Well, probably the most famous recent one was in the early 2000s. I believe it was 2001. There was a vaccine we had for children for rotavirus. And as this vaccine rolled out, it was noticed that this particular problem that kids can have called intussusception, which is a looping of the bowel on itself, so you end up with having a potentially infarcted bowel problem, was occurring with higher frequency than was expected. It's something that you see. Pediatricians see it from time to time. They were seeing more of them, and seeing more of them in the week after kids got this vaccine. Well, it turned out that by giving the vaccine, it was an oral vaccine. By giving that vaccine, you got a little bit of lymph node hyperplasia in the gut, and for some kids, that little lymph node turned into enough of a glitch as their bowels normally moved that they would get this telescoping. And so it was a very, very rare event, but nonetheless an increased event. So that vaccine was pulled off the market. Later, and that vaccine was developed by a company called Wyeth. Later, Merck developed a vaccine. It's a really important disease. Rotavirus is a major cause of infant mortality, and not in the United States. In the United States, it makes kids sick and have diarrhea for a few days. But in the rest of the world, kids can die from it. So there was a need to make this vaccine. And so Merck made it, but part of the work that they had to do in agreement with the FDA was to show that they didn't cause this intussusception to occur again. So they had to do 70,000 babies before their vaccine was approved. So that's actually the largest pre-licensure database we've ever had for a vaccine. But it was because that particular vaccine had been associated previously with the safety signal. Therefore, you had to do more work to know that it was safe enough to launch the next one.
But we're talking about very minuscule amounts of recipients who are experiencing side effects. You don't anticipate this side effect doing something like, I don't know, wiping out fertility for an entire generation who takes it?
Yeah.
Like, that's pretty much out of the question.
Yeah, well, so it would be very unusual for something like to happen. When I hear people concerned about fertility, it's usually because they're confused about RNA and DNA. And so these are RNA vaccines, and the way that our bodies work is we have our genetic information is coded in DNA, which gets activated to make RNA, which then turns into protein. So it goes DNA to RNA to protein. It doesn't go, in humans, we don't turn RNA into DNA. So some people have just gotten confused about, well, it's RNA and DNA, isn't that all my genetic information? No, it's not. It's the information that gets copied from your genetic information to make a protein. Now, the other signal about might there be something related to reproductive potential would be, does the infection cause a change in people's reproductive potential? We don't see there aren't a lot of, in fact, I don't know of a single infection that is a major cause of infertility, other than sexually transmitted infections, but that's a mechanical issue, not a immunological one. In other words, if people have damage to their say fallopian tubes, then that can impair their ability to get pregnant. Or if you have damage to your testicles, that can cause problems and the like, but not because you've got a viral infection. So all that said, we're very reluctant in science to say can't do it until we've seen that it really can't be done. So the risk is essentially zero, but it's not zero. And we wouldn't say that it's zero. Now, I'll give you an example that we used in this clotting problem, which happens in 1 in a million people who receive the J&J vaccine. The risk of having that clotting problem is the same risk of being in a car accident if you drive 15 miles. Well, we all know that the risk isn't zero if you drive your car 15 miles, but the risk is so low that we frankly don't consider it. So that's an example of how low the frequency of these risks are. And of course, whatever risk we have from the vaccine, we would argue at this point in time is much less than the risk you have from getting COVID infection. And some people say, well, young people don't have much of a risk when they get COVID infection. That's true. Most don't. But some do. And there have been young people who've died, young people who've had, turned into long haulers or had other, long-term complications. And we don't see any of that with people who've gotten the vaccine. Therefore, we argue better get the vaccine than the infection.
Sure. Wow. Is fertility kind of the big thing that people are worried about with this vaccine? Well,
that's the thing that I hear the most about. But I also just hear this, unknown about long-term safety just generally. And I've heard the fertility concerns more and more as we've moved out of people my age and into people your age who are getting vaccinated. When it was us old people at the start, no one was worried about fertility.
Right. But it's essentially the risk is so minuscule, and the reward of vaccinating our country so that we can move forward is so great. It seems like, in your professional opinion, you can move forward with this pretty much with no hesitation.
Again, driving your car 15 miles isn't without risk, but I do it all the time, every day, multiple times a day, without thinking about it at all. And that's the way I feel about the safety of these vaccines. That's the same risk. This 15 miles of driving is the same risk we have for the worst adverse event there is. Not for any adverse event, for the worst one.
The absolute worst one is equivalent to driving your car 15 miles. Yep. And by going through and vaccinating yourself, you are really doing your society a service. Really.
Well, there's two issues. One is that you're protecting your own health, but secondly, you're minimizing your risk to others. And different people value themselves versus others in different ways. But the point is, there's benefit to both, and so we would argue that you should get immunized.
Yeah. So I'm curious of where other hesitations might crop up. So we've talked about safety. What about just, the Bill Gates microchip theory that we're all being, had codes put into our cellular DNA?
Yeah. Well, so the FDA requires testing of lots of vaccine after they're made, and there aren't materials like that. In fact, if people who really want to see what the testing is, you can go to either the FDA's website and look up a link on the FDA's website called review materials for whatever vaccine that you're interested in, or you can look at the package insert that the manufacturer makes, and it'll tell you what the materials are. That package insert is regulated by the FDA in terms of what you have to say and what you can't say. So those are two sources of information people could go to see what's actually in there. The microwave chip thing, I don't really know how to respond to it other than to say there aren't microwave chips in there.
Where do you think that the biggest pushback then is coming from? Who is telling people that this is not a good idea to get this?
So right, everybody's different, right? Everybody has their own set of reasons. But the thing that's been the most fascinating to me is to see how the change in vaccine hesitancy has shifted with the political wins. So if you go back pre-COVID, actually, if you go back prior to the Trump administration, vaccine hesitancy was essentially a phenomena of the left. And I'm not at all saying that all people who were left-leaning were vaccine hesitant, but the frequency was higher in the left than the right. Now, this is a right cause. The left is all for vaccination, and now it's the right that is anti-vaccine for the most part. And again, there's lots of wiggle room. Lots of exceptions to those rules. But it's really become an issue of, more of a cultural issue than a scientific issue. And it really comes down, in my mind, to epistemology. That is, how do we know what we know? And what we tend to do in our culture is we tend to listen to people who are like us. And if the people who are like us, the message is, watch out, we tend to watch out and not really so much look at data and say, well, how does this risk compare to that risk? And how does the risk benefit work out? We tend to listen to voices that we trust. And so when the voices were from the left, the people on the left tended to listen to those voices. When the voices were on the right, a different group of people listened to those voices, and the people who used to not listen to that are now anti that. So it's been this shifting thing based on what's the messaging from the persons that you trust or have faith in, and as that messaging has changed, then it's changed. I really think it's really unfortunate that this situation has become, in my mind, politically polarized, because if you look at what was accomplished in the last year of the Trump administration with regard to getting these vaccines developed, everything that we have today, we have because the Trump administration put the money on the table to move these products through. These are faster than we've ever seen any other vaccine ever developed. And you'll remember when we first started this exercise, I said, I think we'll be lucky if we have vaccines in 2 years. Here it is 1 year later, and the U.S. has been immunized, practically. We expect at the end of this year we'll have 13 billion doses of vaccine for the world. That's just beyond what anybody could ever imagine. And that happened because the Trump administration primed the pump. So now we've come on, and now there's a new administration, and that administration has to criticize what the previous administration did wrong and did right, and so now we're complaining about this and about that. It's just a really unfortunate thing. Instead of us being able to celebrate, look what those guys did. Now look what these guys are doing. This has turned out for the U.S. in spite of all the damage, all the economic damage, and all the people who died. We had a greater increase over the expected rate of death in this country last year than we've ever had, including the 1918 influenza pandemic. It was the worst year for American deaths ever. That was horrible. But now we're on the brink of stopping this thing in the U.S. If people would just come along and just help us get the last bit of the way there, this can be just a bad memory in the U.S. Again, in the rest of the world, we're still working on it. But having 13 billion doses by the end of the year means by the end of this year, we'll have immunized most of the world. And again, remember when we started this, I didn't think anybody would get immunized for 2 years. In 2 years, the world will be immunized. It's been a crazy positive thing that has happened.
Wow. What do you think your responsibility is as a citizen? If you have a spiritual view of this, how is that reflected too?
Well, so let's first start with just for your average person, what's the just as a citizen, what are your duties? And here's where I think we've gotten a bit off track in our country. We've tended to divide into the red and the blue, and the red is against the blue and the blue is against the red, as opposed to us saying, what's good for everybody? What's the common good in this situation? How do we, as a community, how do we do what's best for everybody? So I don't really care whether people are red or blue and what you think about whatever anybody else thinks about this situation. I'm like, it's best for everybody if as many of us can get vaccinated as we can. There are some people who can't get vaccinated, people who have allergies or have other issues that make it so that it's not appropriate to immunize them. Those people can't get vaccinated. But if all the rest of us do, then we protect those people that can't get vaccinated. So I just take a step back and say, what's best for everybody? And let's just do that. And so what's in the common good is, hey, let's all get immunized. And then if when we're done getting immunized, let's send all the rest of our vaccine out to the rest of the world so they can all get immunized, because that's what's best for everybody. One of the things that's been, let's talk about it for Christians for a second. One of the things that's been disappointing to me about this about the response of Christians to this pandemic has been that I think we have allowed politics to co-opt our faith and our life and our practice about how are we members of society in the midst of a pandemic. And we've instead turned into this political thing where it's kind of become more about my freedom than my obligation to participate in society. So I told you earlier, I had a friend. I have a friend named Greg Poland who runs the Mayo Clinic Vaccine Research Group, and he shared
which is a pretty prestigious role.
Yeah. He's the head of the Vaccine Research Group at the Mayo Clinic. Edits a journal called Vaccine, the most important vaccine journal in the world. So
he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, and he's been a friend since the early 90s. Mm-hmm. But he shared two quotes with me that I found really fascinating, and this is for Christians. In 1625, during the bubonic plague, there was a Baptist pastor in England named William Cranshaw. So this was what he said in a sermon to his people about how do we live in light of the bubonic plague being here. And so he said, all public meetings should be forbidden, such that the healthy and the sick can be separated. The theaters should be closed. We avoid putting oneself in needless danger, such as among infected persons. And we should use all the good helps which God's providence affords, such as physicians, medicines, we could add vaccines, which they didn't have in 1625. Eat and drink in moderation, and abhor more than poison the wicked opinions that pestilence is not infectious, that anyone may do whatever he wants, and that avoid persons and places as a means for preservation is of help. Mm-hmm. So this is a guy from 1625, before the germ theory even existed, saying this is how Christians should interact in a situation where disease is moving around. Mm-hmm. We don't know why, we don't know how. This is what we should do. We should isolate, not run away, but isolate. Let's be helpful to the community. And then another example, there's a very famous reformer named Martin Luther, who also was around during a time of plague, and he wrote a letter.
What plague was this?
This is bubonic plague. And bubonic plague lasted for about 100 years, off and on. It would kind of come up and go back down again. But he wrote a letter that your listeners can look online to find. The letter is entitled, "Whether One Can Flee from a Deadly Plague." And he said in this letter, I shall fumigate, purify the air, administer medicines, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order to not become contaminated, and thus perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. Now, if my neighbor needs me, I shall not avoid his place or person, but go freely and assist. Moreover, he who has contracted the disease should keep away from others, and so act towards others such that no one becomes unnecessarily endangered on his account, and so cause another's death. If anyone would help ward off contagion as best he can, then the death toll would indeed be more moderate. But if some are so foolish as to not take precautions, but instead to aggravate the contagion, then many will die. Mm-hmm. So to look back and realize that what the church was saying 500 years ago is relevant to us now, and that we, to me, haven't learned and are repeating some of the same mistakes is unfortunate. He had one other quote that I really liked from a more recent poet, George Bernard Shaw, who said, "The one thing we can learn from history is that we never learn from history."
Yeah, wow. And I wonder if back then in the bubonic plague, if it was somewhat politically divided as well.
Well, I'm sure that it was, or at least class divided, or we have this tendency to sort ourselves into us and them, and I am sure that the same things went on then. It's just, to me, Christians more than anyone should be able to look above self-interest into community interest and find ways to move towards one another respecting one another and not aggravating problems, but trying to solve problems.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Martin. Really appreciate it.